Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, before we get into the big playoff games this week in the Divisional Round, there have been lots of coaching moves the last couple of days. What do you like? What don't you like? And what are you curious to see out there?
I'm really interested in Bruce Arians to Tampa Bay, which, of course, first of all, is a good indication that the word retirement means absolutely nothing to NFL coaches. I wish they would just say quit when they don't want a job anymore instead of retire, because they all come back and take another job later.
The funny one there, too, is that they actually, like, the NFL was like, oh, Bruce Arians, he retired, but his contract was kind of up. And then they realized that it kind of actually wasn't. So they ended up having to throw like a 6th round pick in exchange for a 7th round pick just to make it like legally viable.
Right. Tampa had to get the rights from
What is
Arizona.
the minimum we can give you? Oh, it's us giving you a 6th round pick in exchange for a 7th round pick.
It's a great marriage because we know Jameis Winston loves to throw deep, and we know that Bruce Arians loves to have his offense throw deep. It also is interesting because it's a more veteran coach, right? There's this real movement towards the young offensive minds. 4 of the 6 coaches that have been hired so far probably could be described as young offensive minds, right? Matt LaFleur, Cliff Kingsbury, Kitchens, and then Adam Gase, I think, still qualifies as a, quote, young offensive mind, even though he's on his 2nd job. So
anybody who's ever like come across Sean McVay on the streets, basically.
Right. Well, Adam Gase doesn't have a.
I don't actually think 2 of those guys do.
Offensive. He's sort of his own offensive expert. But I mean, the most interesting hire is probably Kingsbury, because it's either Kingsbury because I don't think anybody saw this coming and he doesn't have a great record at college, or it's Kitchens because this is a guy nobody was thinking of until he took over the Cleveland offense midseason. And the Cleveland offense was so good in the second half of the season that essentially the Browns had to do this, or else he was going to be a hot head coaching candidate next year. And even if they kept him as offensive coordinator for a year, he would end up leaving. So they sort of had to give him the job.
We talked about that one, and I think we both are on the same page. We like that decision, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good gamble given what he did with the offense in the last 8 weeks. And let's see, you want him to hire a good defensive coordinator to run his defense, because, a lot of these coaches are real offensive minds where you don't know how much that they do defense, and you want them to be something like what Sean McVay has in with the Rams, where he basically just turned the whole defense over to Wade Phillips.
And you love the Bruce Arians situation, like you were mentioning before, Todd Bowles to run the defense. That's a pretty good guy right there to have running the show.
Right. And I will say one of the good arguments about Cliff Kingsbury that I've seen online is so much of what you do in college is based on recruiting, and it's really hard to convince people to come and play in Lubbock. And I mean, if you're an offensive mind, it's going to be a lot easier to convince offensive players to come play for you in Lubbock than defensive players. So maybe it's not Cliff Kingsbury's fault that his defenses were never any good at Texas Tech, and therefore that the teams didn't win a lot of games. In the NFL, the talent is going to be a lot more equalized across teams. There is some good defensive talent. Arizona has Patrick Peterson. They've got Chandler Jones. They're probably going to have Nick Bosa with the number 1 overall pick. So if he's got a good defensive coordinator, he can run a good defense, and then we're just going to see what kind of an offensive mind he is. So
you're not buying the hype that Kingsbury's going to take Kyler Murray number 1 overall?
No, I mean, that's based on something he said when he never thought he was going to get a job in the NFL. So I don't buy the hype. If they do that, they'll be able to trade Rosen for something, but I doubt severely. I would think he's going to keep Rosen and take Nick Bosa number 1 overall.
So I was talking about I'd agree with you. I think Bosa is the odds-on favorite to be number 1 overall. I was talking to some friends before, though, and said if Kyler Murray plays football, he's a first-round quarterback, and he might be the first quarterback off the board. It's him or Haskins, really, in my eyes. And I think there's a good argument for him to be the first quarterback off. Fascinating, because he's going to get on that height chart, and it's going to say that he's 5'8" or whatever else it is. And it's going to be really fascinating. We should start like a stock market watch of Kyler Murray and how he tumbles and goes up and down the draft board.
Right. He's not just shorter than Russell Wilson and Drew Brees. He's shorter than Doug Flutie.
Doug Flutie hilariously listed at 5'10", I learned this morning, which that doesn't seem possible at all.
But I mean, if he's listed at 5, I mean, How tall do you think Flutie is? 5'8", 5'9"? That's about the same as Kyler Murray?
They're probably the same size, right?
But so Murray will be listed at 5'10" too.
It'll be really interesting to see. I think like you said, these hirings are really interesting, how they've gone down from Kingsbury kind of being way off the radar to some of the ones that we really expected to fall into place. Gase going to the Jets, I think, is incredibly interesting. We'll be watching out. And there's still a few more jobs that are still waiting to be filled. So kind of taking their time moving forward with some of these openings, and we'll see how that goes.
It's interesting because you can make an argument that Adam Gase is a pretty good head coach. Here's the question. When a team has a bad efficiency rating, right? Like they're bad in DVOA, they're bad in raw stats, and they win more games than they would be expected to win given their efficiency ratings, is that a sign of luck, or is that a sign that a coach is good at coaching to more wins than his team's talent would otherwise indicate? Because if it's a latter, then that's a really good statement about Adam Gase, because 2 of the 3 years he was in Miami, they way outperformed their DVOA.
I think that it was a sign that they got lucky and they outperformed their Pythagorean expectations. And in actuality, they weren't a very good team, and the coach has to be responsible for how good the team is, their efficiency rates. I think that's what you can control, right? More than the wins and losses. But I will agree. If you win all the close games based on great coaching and game management, decision-making, sure.
And there's also an argument that Gase can't be blamed for the injury, right? Tannehill didn't improve under him particularly, but he also, he lost his quarterback for all of last year and had to play a geriatric Jay Cutler instead. So I don't know. There's interesting arguments that Adam Gase's time in Miami, that he's a better head coach than people might realize. It's an interesting hire by the Jets. I know Tanier, I was in the middle of texting with Tanier last night when the Gase got hired, and he was like, well, okay, now Tom Brady can win the division from a wheelchair for the next 3 years. But I don't know if it's quite that easy to write off.
Yeah, I think we all got to remember how much that we don't know. But certainly on paper, I can see why a Jets fan would be concerned.
Miami and Cincinnati are the only 2 jobs that remain open. A lot of the talk is that Chris Richard is going to be the guy in Miami, and that they're just waiting for Dallas to be out of the playoffs, and that Cincinnati is either going with Hugh Jackson or Vance Joseph, or some combination of Hugh Jackson and Vance Joseph, all of which sounds terrible to me.
I'm not going to disagree with you there. On that note, let's take a look around the league and let's look at these big 4 games coming up this weekend. The first one is going to be on Saturday, the Colts at the Chiefs. We saw Indianapolis. They sat in their cover 2 all day long, just as we expected, and they frustrated Deshaun Watson, who we noted struggled against that cover 2 during the regular season. The zone coverage helped mitigate his ability to run. And when the Chiefs have the ball, I'm very curious in this game to see if Indy can stay in that preferred cover 2 that they like, or if Kansas City and their running backs, remember, no Kareem Hunt, can attack the light box that the cover 2 is going to leave you in and make the Colts adjust. I think that's going to be a big question there, is actually if the Chiefs can get into a place where they're getting $5-6 a pop on the run game, all of a sudden the Colts might have to abandon that cover 2, and I think that could be a big part of the storyline.
Yeah, I will say, first of all, the biggest point about this game is that the Colts have been the hottest team in the league over the second half of the year.
Both sides of the ball, no doubt about it.
Therefore, this is the number 1 team in weighted DVOA, which is Kansas City, against the number 2 team. Despite being the number 1 seed, the Chiefs got a kind of a very difficult draw here. And, of course, it makes Chiefs fans feel even worse because there's a whole history of the Colts beating the Chiefs in awful ways in the playoffs, going all the way back to the 90s and the Joe Montana time. But I will say, as far as the Kansas City offense goes, they haven't really lost rushing efficiency without Kareem Hunt. What they've lost is the running backs as receivers. That's where the decline has been. But I think that they'll be able to –
and the deep passing we looked at too.
Yeah. They'll be able to run the ball with Damian Williams. I don't know what Spencer Ware's health situation is. I will point out that I did see the tweet from someone from Sports Info Solutions that Mahomes has been the most effective quarterback in the league versus zone coverage this season from a points earned per attempt perspective. So he's not the guy you want to sit back and cover 2 against.
Right. Really interesting there. So now, it's not the Colts running the cover 2. Obviously, they do a good job with it. But when the Chiefs have faced cover 2 this year, they rank second in the NFL in average expected points added per dropback. They faced it 68 times, and they averaged 36 expected points added per 100 dropbacks. That's second in the NFL. A big reason why they've done this has been boom plays. And Bryce Rossler, one of our researchers, did really good work on this. They've had 68 dropbacks against cover 2. 20 of them have been boom plays, which we define as a play with an EPA above 1. You can kind of think of that on average, that would be about a 16-yard gain, but obviously depending on the down and distance, the EPA will be varied, and of course the field position. So what are the Chiefs doing against the cover 2? Bryce looked into this, and he noted that the Chiefs like to attack vertically. They sent 3 or more receivers on deep routes against cover 2 22% of the time. And league-wide, these concepts result in a boom play 25% of the time for whatever offense it is. So when you're against that cover 2, if you can get multiple vertical threats down the field, it makes sense. You're going to create stress on those 2 guys on the back end. Teams have success when they go there. The Chiefs have gone to that well lots of times, and it's worked out well for them. Now, if the Colts decide to adjust and use their second most common coverage, the cover 3, the Chiefs' passing offense has struggled much more. That's their lowest coverage that they've faced. They average just 15 expected points per 100 dropbacks against cover 3. And the Colts run it 20% of the time. So it's not like they never use that. It'll be really fascinating to see how they'll mix up those coverages, and I'm going to be staring at that the whole day. I think if they can stay back and they can keep Tyreek Hill in front of them, I think that it's the Colts' game to win. But if the Chiefs can sort of influence them to have to be focused on other things because they're too efficient with their short stuff, then all of a sudden, and the running game, then all of a sudden I think the Colts could be adjusting. So it'll be a fascinating matchup.
The other problem is Travis Kelce, because the Colts are 29th in DVOA against tight ends. That is not a matchup number you want to have when you're facing Travis Kelce. They gave up a big game to Gronk, one of Gronk's few big games this year. They gave up a big game to Ingram. They gave up 70 yards in the same game to both Goddard and Ertz from Philadelphia. So this should be a big Kelce game, and that is also, I think, a big problem. On the other side of the ball, though, it's like I looked up some receiver matchups for the Colts offense versus the Chiefs defense, but gee, why would you even ever want to throw the ball? Because the Chiefs defense is so bad against the run this year. They're 12th against the pass, but the worst defense in the league against the run. And I just think it's going to given what Marlon Mack did against the best run defense in the league last week, I can only imagine what he could do and what this offensive line, more importantly, what the offensive line of the Colts can do against the worst run defense in the league.
Yeah, the Colts offensive line against that run defense is obviously a huge matchup to be looking at. And you've got to think that the Chiefs are going to be committing a lot of people to stopping the run game. But that could leave them in danger with Andrew Luck because he's been performing really well, just as well. One great stat on the Colts O-line, we all know about Quentin Nelson. His blown block rate is 0.5%. So that's one blown block on every 200 snaps this year. That's the 5th best rate in the league. There's a reason why he's going to go to a lot of all-pro teams over the course of his career.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting because the Colts really match up so well against the Chiefs' by far biggest weakness. I've got to say, I have been driving the Chiefs bandwagon since early in the year. DVOA loves them this year, probably more than any other advanced stat out there. Part of me is pulling for them because I like to be right, but this is like the worst matchup they could have gotten. So
looking deeper kind of into what might be working into their favor, like you said before, there's the Kelce problem, there's the Tyreek Hill problem. There's not an issue with what they can maybe – it's a strong offense against a strong defense on that side of the ball. Is there anything that could make us think that when the Colts have the ball, the Chiefs could be at an advantage? They are playing at home against this team, and their pressure rate, for example, has been much better at home than it is on the road. I think they've had 40% pressure rate at home, which is 3rd in the NFL, and 25th at 27% on the road. So that's a huge margin, and I don't know, potentially they can get to Andrew Luck, and he's not the same when he's under pressure. He's not the same when he's on the road. But I'm with you. There are reasons to think that the Colts can win this one.
I mean, they're 9th in DVOA against wide receiver 1, which means maybe they can hold Hilton back a little bit, but they can't really. because even though in efficiency-wise they're good against wide receiver one, in volume, teams tend to throw to their wide receiver. They leave that wide receiver one open for passes a lot. They face the most passes per game in the league to wide receiver one, and they're 29th in yards allowed to wide receiver one. So despite being efficient, like there's going to be a lot of throws to Hilton probably. There'll be open throws to him when the Colts do want to throw the ball. So it's really hard to see where the Chiefs defense has a real advantage in this game.
Well, if they can get ahead and force the Colts to get out of being able to run the ball, then all of a sudden, get that D Ford pass rush going.
Right, but I mean, the way that they give up yards on the ground, I don't think you ever give up on the run, because the run is going to get you efficient yardage almost the way passing does against almost any other team in the league. That's how much rushing yards you can get against the Chiefs.
It'll be an interesting matchup. Let's keep moving around to the Cowboys at the Rams. I don't know if I told you this, but I ended up in Jerry's World for the Cowboys game against the Seahawks, which was great because it's a fun place to see a game and it was a crazy environment, but it was a boring football game. Nobody seemed like they wanted to win. It was definitely strength on strength as Football Analytics Twitter took on Ground and Pound Twitter. Both teams very committed to the run. But the Cowboys came out ahead, and I don't think the Cowboys are just a walkover for the Rams at all. This might actually be a tough matchup for the Rams in this one. What do you think?
Well, the one thing is the Rams have faded. They're the one of the four home teams this weekend. The Rams are the one that have sort of faded in the second half of the year, whereas the Patriots have gotten better, and the Chiefs have stayed pretty much the same, and the Saints have gotten better on defense, which counteracts them getting worse on offense. The Rams have sort of faded a bit. The last 5 weeks, they have a cumulative pass offense DVOA of minus 2.6%, which ranks 22nd over that 5-week period, which is kind of a shock. I will say one thing that's really interesting. The Rams are only 20 against the run this year, so you would think, oh, well, that totally plays into the strength of the Cowboys. But the Cowboys are not as run-focused in offense as we would seem to think. They're only 19th in run DVOA. And I looked at run pass ratio in the first half of games. So trying to take out game script specific second half situations. Dallas was only 10th in run pass ratio in the first half of games. I really would have expected them to be up there with Seattle, and they're not. So they're not as run focused as you might think, which means, I don't know, maybe they're not as ready to take advantage of the Rams' weakness on run defense as we might think.
So that's a really interesting note, because I think you definitely think of the Cowboys as being more that ground and pound. I wonder if that's changed from the first half of the season to the second half of the season, and where that's been in terms of all that. I was actually looking at some tendencies from the Rams, and I thought it was interesting how they slowed down over the latter part of the year, but also they, for the most part, had sealed things up. They knew they were going to be at least a playoff team. They ended up sealing the bye, but not the home field advantage throughout. But they use shotgun the least amount of any team in the league. They use it on only 38% of all snaps, not exactly what we think of when we think of these really progressive offense. So when they're in shotgun, it's a big tendency. They're almost guaranteed to throw the ball. They throw it on 96% of the time when they're in shotgun. Meanwhile, 96% of their run plays happen from under center. And that's an interesting matchup in this one because the Cowboys' defense is very good against the run. They're even better against the run on under center run plays. They're second in the NFL, allowing only 3.3 yards per carry on those plays. They're ranked 11th against shotgun runs, allowing 4.2 yards per carry. And what I'm curious to see is if the Rams start to switch up some of these tendencies as we get into the playoffs. We saw their jet motion was a huge tendency at one point in the year. We see this shotgun tendency right now. I don't think Sean McVay is stupid. I think that what we can expect to see here is to see them go way far against their tendencies on some of the things that they're doing and really confuse the Cowboys and then maybe get back to their typical script as they try to build a lead after the early part of this game. I think it'll be really interesting to see how the Rams decide to attack the Cowboys, especially given that the Cowboys just don't have the firepower offensively. If the Cowboys are going to do it, run-pass ratio be damned, they're going to do it through Ezekiel Elliott. So it'll be interesting to see how the Rams try to attack this Chris Richard defense.
It's also interesting to see how the defense will play against them. The Cowboys use zone coverage 51% of the time, which was 7th most in the league. And Jared Goff was 2nd in the league in yards per pass against man coverage at 9.3 yards per attempt. but he was only at 8.0 yards per attempt against zone, which ranked 18th. So,
and it's been especially problematic since Cooper Kupp went out, because he's a big part of that zone coverage safety blanket.
Against zone, and the Cowboys are going to play zone against him.
Yep, it's a tough matchup there. The Cowboys running that cover 3 really well. I thought it was really interesting. I got a chance to actually meet with one of the members of the Cowboys scouting department right there, and he was just talking about how good a fit Byron Jones has been in that cover 3 scheme with the Cowboys. Remember, they drafted him as a safety. He had played some safety and some corner at UConn. We all knew about his incredible athleticism, but it hasn't really been until this year where he's settled into that corner spot, the long-armed, Richard Sherman type of corner in that defense. And he's really been a nice fit there. So it's an interesting idea. We're always talking about busts and draft prospects and were you right or were you wrong. Sometimes you just got to get into the right situation. You got to find the right role. And it really seems that that's what's happened with him this year.
Dallas very strong this year against wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2. Weaker elsewhere. 26th against running backs as receivers. So perhaps Todd Gurley and those screen passes is going to be a big weapon for the Rams in this game.
You should expect it when the Cowboys have the ball. Meanwhile, Ezekiel Elliott, first in the NFL in rushing yards after contact, 8th in yards after contact per attempt with 3 yards after contact per attempt. The Rams defense allows the 5th most yards after contact per attempt, also at 3 yards after contact per shot. So look out for that matchup. Like we were saying before, the Cowboys definitely want to run the ball. The Rams defense is first in pressure percentage, and Dak Prescott has struggled against pressure this year. His yards per attempt drops from 8 to 6.1. His IQR drops from 108 to 80 against pressure. So a tough matchup there if that's what it becomes. Look for the Cowboys to have a very predictable game script in this one.
And there's going to be pressure up the middle, right? Aaron Donald led the league in sacks, led the league in pressures. And Dallas's center, Joe Looney, and guard Xavier Su'a-Filo both made the top 20 interior linemen in blown blocks by the SIS charting. I know Su'a-Filo may not play in this game. He didn't play in last week's game, but that probably just makes things worse because Connor Williams, if they thought Connor Williams was better than Su'a-Filo, they would have been playing him all year long. So there's weakness up the middle for the offensive line for Dallas against the pass, and strength for the Rams.
Yeah, you don't want to lead in blown blocks in that case. That's not a good thing, and they're definitely going to miss Travis Frederick against that Aaron Donald fellow. All right, let's move forward to your Patriots hosting the Chargers in cold Foxborough. Last week, going into the Chargers-Ravens game, we talked about the Ravens defense and how they've been built to play against these modern offenses with extra DBs on the field, light boxes, and lots of blitzes. But it was the Chargers who lead the league in dime personnel usage, using 6 or more defensive backs 63% of the time, that went all in, taking it to a new level. They played with 7 defensive backs for most of the game, frustrating Lamar Jackson. I thought that was one of the most fascinating matchups of the weekend, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what I think is a better team in the Chargers going to play against the Patriots at home in the playoffs.
Right. Like there's certain things that are working against the Chargers that are not about how good these teams would be in a neutral field and neutral situation. The fact that it's their second straight week going on the road at 10 a.m. body clock time. The fact that it is the road, the fact that the Patriots had the week off, all of that stuff works against the Chargers, but none of that will come out in any of this matchup stuff we're going to talk about.
Also, one thing that it's going to be hard to actually really quantify is just how good Melvin Ingram was this past week, and if he can do that sort of thing again. One thing that I noticed that the Chargers were doing, even with their light boxes, is they were finding ways to isolate their best pass rushers against the worst offensive linemen. You saw Hurst on the Ravens get abused and eventually pulled out of the game because they were just lining up guys against him and teeing off there. The Patriots have shown some issues on their offensive line this year. One thing that the Chargers are definitely going to need to do, because any team that's ever beaten the Patriots in the Tom Brady, Bill Belichick era has been getting pressure up front, especially with that front four. So I'm looking out for Melvin Ingram in this game. If he can do anything like what he was the other day, I thought he played as well as anybody over the course of last weekend.
You also, when you look at the Chargers secondary and what they do playing all those safeties, first of all, number 1 in DVOA against tight ends this year, right? Like Gronk has had a bad year by Gronk standards. By tight end standards, Gronk has still had a good year. Gronk was still something like 5th or 6th in DYAR value for tight ends. But this is a really hard defense to go to your tight end against. The other thing I'm going to point out, the Chargers 31st against deep passes, but third against short passes. And what is the Patriots offense seems to mostly be depending on short passes. Now, this is a surprise to me. The Patriots were actually 10th in the league in DVOA on deep passes to find a 16 or more yards past the line of scrimmage. So they were better on deep passes than I think any of us realized. But they throw short more often than the average team, and the Chargers are really strong against those short passes.
Right. So they're saying they're up in there in DVOA means that not necessarily that they use it more often or to create more value, but that when they go to it, that it's pretty efficient.
Yeah,
right?
Compared to the average team, the Patriots were an above average team on deep passes, right? There's this feeling that Brady's really lost his deep arm, and that obviously they were going deep a lot less this year without Brandon Cooks on the field because he's no longer on the team. But they were still an above average team on deep passes. But the Chargers were really weak against deep passes, but really strong against short passes. And the Patriots offense is still built mostly on short passes.
So I have a hypothetical usage versus efficiency question. Who's better at deep passing? A team that throws 100 deep passes and averages 10 yards per attempt on those deep passes, or a team that throws 200 deep passes and averages 9.5 yards per attempt on those?
Right. I mean, the team that averages 100 is better on efficiency, but the other one is better on volume. And it sort of depends on, is the team in question the kind of team that is going to just do its offense no matter what you do? Or are they the kind of team that's going to figure out what your weakness is and attack it? In this case, the Patriots are a team that's going to figure out what your weakness is and attack it. So in this case, the Patriots probably will throw deep more often if they feel that that's a weakness of the Chargers that they could take advantage of.
It'll be interesting. I think I'll be fascinated to see if Tom Brady can do that. There was a really great article. Was it Mike Tanier that wrote that article about the decline of Tom Brady this week?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the fact is I wrote one a couple weeks ago about the lack of decline from Tom Brady. It sort of depends on what numbers you look at. If you look at raw efficiency numbers, Brady is not much different this year than he was in 2014 and 2015. He was better in 2016 and 2017. So he's declined from those 2 years, but he hasn't declined the way I think we all expected him to. We all expected this aging thing that he would really decline. But if you look specifically at things like time to throw and throwing downfield, obviously he's thrown downfield a lot less this year, but some of that is connected to the lack of Cooks in the offense. It's a complicated discussion about Brady declining. Partly because you have to decide just how much decline do you mean by decline. Obviously, he's declined. It's pretty hard to argue against the idea that he's declined. But just what do you mean by that? How much work? He still was one of the top 6 or 7 quarterbacks in the league this year, but he was clearly not number 1 or number 2.
That seems like a fair way to sum it all up. We talked about Melvin Ingram. One other Melvin that I think is going to be important. This one is Melvin Gordon. He had obviously an incredible season, but slowed by injuries in the later part of the year. He finished the regular season with 5.1 yards per carry, over a yard better than his previous career high. Obviously, the knee injury set him back. Weeks 1 through 12, yards per attempt was at 5.2, but just 3.2 yards per attempt since then. And it's been directly attributed to the yards after contact. I remember we did a study a couple of years ago where we looked at running backs that come back from lower body injuries, and we saw that specifically in terms of yards after contact, there was effect for multiple games that would linger on and that would affect the running back's efficiency going forward. The same thing has happened with Melvin Gordon. 3.3 yards after contact per attempt pre-injury, 1.7 since. We talked about Ezekiel Elliott being at 3.0 to give you a sense of context there. So it's a major element of his game. He's got a 24% broken tackle percentage, which is second in the NFL, but he hasn't been the same guy, and I don't think either of his backups are quite what he brings to the table, and that's one place where I think you really want to attack the Patriots this year.
Well, Eckler's pretty good, and Eckler brings a lot of the tackle breaking that Gordon brought. And Gordon, a lot of it was breaking tackles early in the year, right? So you're seeing fewer broken tackles. You're seeing less yards after contact. But Eckler's pretty good. If Eckler's healthy, he's pretty good too.
Absolutely. Very good player.
I think it's the passing matchup that's interesting here because Rivers was 7.99 yards per attempt against man coverage. 9.55 against zone. But New England is the number one man coverage team of the year per SAS charting. They have maybe the best cornerback in the league this year in Stephon Gilmore. It's going to be really interesting to see who Gilmore covers, because you would think he's going to cover Keenan Allen, but there's some thought that he might cover Mike Williams because they need the height of Gilmore against Mike Williams being 6'4". But that man coverage is Rivers eats the zone coverage, and they're not going to see much zone coverage from the Patriots.
And one guy that might be interesting in this one finally is Hunter Henry. Don't forget, in 2017, he had a 123 receiver ranking, second amongst tight ends, 9.3 yards per target, which was third amongst tight ends. We could finally see him back, although for their part, the Patriots have defended tight ends pretty well this year.
All right, on to the last game of the weekend. Bring on the one rematch.
Yeah, the Eagles unlikely putting it together against the Bears last week. We noted that he had unsustainable excellence against pressure, and he sustained it against the Bears. The rest of the Eagles just really seem to be playing at a different level with him at quarterback. And, of course, the ghost of Robbie Gould continues to hurt Bears fans. I think he's missed like one or two kicks since they got rid of him a few years ago, and they can't catch a break. Cody Parkey just hitting all those uprights.
I'm going to guess that the Eagles are not going to lose this game 48-7.
That seems like an aggressive take. What makes you say that?
Well, they're playing a little bit better now than they were then. It's funny because you said it just seems like the team plays better around Nick Foles. Well, the part of the team that plays better around Nick Foles has been the defense. These are kind of remarkable numbers. But the Eagles' defensive DVOA in the 6 games started by Foles is about minus 18%. In the games started by Wentz, it's about plus 8%. And that has nothing to do with Foles or Wentz at all. But Foles has just been, the beneficiary of a defense that has played much better in his game. He has played, if you include both the first 2 weeks of the season and the last 4 weeks, he's played about the same quality as Wentz. He's been a little bit better in these last 4 weeks, but was worse in the first 2. But that defense has been so much better in the Foles starts. That's why the Eagles look so much better in the Foles starts.
And with all the injuries earlier in the year, I think the secondary really went through some hard times, but I think that they have kind of found a couple of players. They have kind of grown into a system back there and gotten a little bit better. All of that said, Trubisky couldn't do enough to really take advantage of some of the matchups that you have against the Eagles on the back end. And I think more likely than not, we're going to see Drew Brees is able to take advantage of that. He's, first in on target percentage on all passes this year. Statistically, just a ridiculous season from an accuracy perspective from Brees. The Eagles have had trouble getting pressure this year, and Brees from a clean pocket, just, even more outstanding and off the charts ridiculous. So I think it's going to be tough for the Eagles to find a way if the Saints can get back and be a semblance of what they were kind of through week 13 there offensively.
Right. The offensive line is more healthy now than it has been over the last few weeks of the season, I believe.
Yeah, that was mean of them to put the Bridgewater out behind the backup offensive lineman they had in week 7.
That's a good plus for the Saints. Yeah. And you have to discount the offensive numbers from week 17, although I'll point out that was their starting defense on the field for the most part in week 17, and it got crushed.
Right.
But when the Eagles, here's the thing about the Eagles on offense. First of all, Eagles 27th in run DVOA. Saints are 3rd against the run. Eagles are 30th in run DVOA over the second half of the season. And since Foles took over as quarterback, 3.23 yards per carry. So there's no running game whatsoever. Obviously, these numbers are not a guarantee. Look at Houston and Indianapolis last week. But for the most part, it's very unlikely the Eagles can run the ball at all.
Agreed.
The other thing, Foles has dominated man coverage and struggled against zone coverage this season. The Saints are more of a man coverage team. Will they switch to more zone coverage in order to take advantage of where Foles has struggled this year?
I wouldn't expect it. I think the Saints are going to do what they do. I think Dennis Allen has kind of put in his scheme, and it really what it is back there. They've defended the run, like you said. They're 3rd in the NFL in pressure rate at 35%. I know Nick Foles has been great against pressure, but I think we just, in this one, when I look at the matchups, you got to just think, unless the Eagles can just continue to do very, very unlikely things. Everything on paper really says that this one should be playing into the hands of the Saints.
Yeah, this is the biggest mismatch of the weekend, except for the problem that last week, the biggest mismatch of the weekend was also Philadelphia.
Can't bet against that Foles magic.
That big passes, Saints, number 32 in defensive DVOA against deep passes, number 9 against short passes. So if Foles can connect deep with Jeffrey or Aguilar, oh boy, there could be another upset.
Oh boy, indeed. On that note, we will sign off. Have a great weekend. Enjoy these awesome, awesome games. It's the last weekend where we get 4 big games this week before we get the championship weekend next week. I can't believe the season's coming to an end. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.